Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking on this issue of tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction. So let me just start off by saying I'm no expert on FCTC. I'm not going to come up with special, here's how we deal with this or WHO that. The reason I've been invited to some of these gatherings is because of my decades of experience in drug policy reform and advocacy for harm reduction with respect to the illicit drugs. And one of the reasons, maybe the dominant reason, I've always been sort of sympathetic to a harm reduction approach across the board. It just makes sense. To me, harm reduction is a pragmatic approach. Harm reduction is the place where public health and human rights intersects. Harm reduction is fundamentally consistent with, common sense, science, public health, compassion, you name it. And that also holds true of tobacco. And so I've always been generally sympathetic to it and kept my eye on it. But a few years ago, Jerry invited me to his global forum on nicotine in Warsaw in 2017. And I had to look more deeply at this issue. And what struck me about this issue is that so much about it reminded me of what got me interested and engaged in the struggle for drug policy reform back in the late 1980s, which was really the height of the drug war, certainly in the US, and to some extent the height of the global drug war. And back then in the 80s, as I was a graduate student and assistant professor, and I was studying and reading and writing and interviewing people in government and all of this sort of stuff, and what struck me was that the more deeply you read, the more deeply you studied this issue, you realize that the science, the economics, the public health, the human rights all suggested that drug policy should be going in this direction, towards a reduced reliance on criminalization, more intelligent reliance on regulatory approaches, acceptance that people use drugs and we have to reduce the harm. But meanwhile, the public, including the elite opinion and the media, and the politicians, not just the conservatives and the reactionaries, but the people who consider themselves progressive, were all heading in the opposite direction. And it was this huge and growing gulf between what good science, evidence, common sense, human rights said should be good drug policy and where, in fact, drug policy was headed, right? Now, I look today at the fight over how to deal with tobacco in our society, in my country and globally, and it seems to me the same thing's going on. The more you read the science, the evidence about tobacco, about now all of these safer nicotine products, about how and what enables people to quit, how addictive cigarettes are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you realize that we should be heading in this direction, in the harm reduction direction, the public health and human rights direction, the science, the evidence-based one. But yet at the same time, we see everything moving the other direction in public opinion and media, right, and government. And what's particularly galling for me, as somebody who's played a leading role in drug policy reform efforts in the US and to some extent around the world, many of the same political figures who were my allies on advocating and ultimately winning battles to legalize medical marijuana, marijuana for all adults, needle exchange programs, methadone maintenance, harm reduction approaches, safe injection, reduced incarceration, reduced criminalization, they're the ones sometimes leading the charge for bans on safer nicotine products, for bans on e-cigarettes and what have you. And it makes me wonder how true their real convictions were to some extent in this. Now, I know that part of the problem of what's going on here is that you have this variable that's somewhat different now, right? Which is with illicit drugs, there were the big evil narcos out there as there are today. But, they weren't playing, they were supplying the market, they were corrupting governments, but they were analogous to, but somewhat different from the role that big tobacco and to some extent the other nicotine-producing firms that are legal today are playing. Yet at the same time, there's this way in which, I have to say I'm really impressed at how savvy the tactics have been of what I would call the tobacco prohibitionists, of the anti-nicotine fanatics. Because what they've done is to sort of create a catch-22, right? Where there is essentially at this time, they know that they cannot win on the evidence, They know they cannot win the public health argument. They know they cannot win from a human rights perspective. Therefore, what they are engaging in, and by the they I'm talking about here, especially coming from the US, Michael Bloomberg and his funding and his money in this area. And the guy's done a lot of good on broader public health and even harm reduction with illicit drugs and overdose prevention, and a lot on tobacco control and anti-smoking. So God bless him for all the good work he's done there. But when you saw him make that commitment a few years ago, on national television in the US, committing $160 million to ban, he said he wanted to ban flavored vaping, but in point of fact, he was also at times quoted as saying he wanted to ban all vaping, right? And then you see him being interviewed, and why you do this? Well, every parent in America should know, he said, that if your child vapes, they could lose 5 or 10 points off their IQ. Really? Now, where'd you get that one from? Now, then I looked at some of his rhetoric, and I realized Bloomberg was a bit of an anti-marijuana fanatic as well. It was what caused him to support policing policies in New York that resulted in 50 to 60,000 young men of color being arrested each year for simply having a little marijuana in their pocket. It was probably one of the major variables which caught up with him when he wanted to run for president and kept him from going any further in that regard. But when you look at, he was basically taking the old anti-marijuana rhetoric about the adolescent brain, about the gateway theory, each of which might best be described as an ounce of truth embedded in a pound of bullshit, right? And he was applying it to the area of tobacco and alternatives to tobacco. So this raised a fundamental question for me. So here you have somebody who is essentially an ideologue on this issue. He is somebody who, when you look at the science, is anti-public health, anti-human rights, right? I mean, that person, yet that same person is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to ban flavored and maybe all vaping. That same person is given at least, almost over $100 million to the foundation associated with the World Health Organization, over $100 million, to the foundation associated with the Center for Disease Control in the United States. And it raises the question, what does conflict of interest mean, right? Now, on the other hand, I see with respect to big tobacco, right, you now have an almost McCarthyist-like approach. And for those of you in London who don't really know what I'm talking about, Joe McCarthy, the famous fanatical anti-communist in America in the early 1950s, and they held congressional hearings, and the question was, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, right? And they demonized and they persecuted all sorts of people, from teachers to politicians to members of the State Department, the military, you name it. But this guilt by association of any way, regardless of who that person really was, regardless of their accomplishments. And so I now see what's going on is I'm engaging in this area as sort of a kind of with fresh eyes, coming from the illicit drug area. I'm meeting these remarkable academics in the US, UK, and other countries around the world, many of them who were real champions and leaders in fighting against big tobacco and smoking and all the duplicitous and evil activities they engaged in throughout the 20th century and into the even into this century. And if any one of them takes a penny from any form of a big tobacco company or even a vape company that's poised against big tobacco or even a foundation that's associated with it, they are being smeared, character assassination, as if they're no different than the hack scientists who worked for big tobacco some decades ago trying to prove that cigarettes were not addictive and that they weren't dangerous. Right? I mean, that is a McCarthyist-like tactic being pursued with major organizations and sometimes in the US government, right, with Bloomberg's funding. Right? So I'm looking at where is the true conflict of interest here. To me, question one can, and sort of, it's scary because when you talk about conflicts of interest, people can be so simplistic-minded about it, like, oh, did you do that? Did you take that money? What have you? But in point of fact, when you take people who've spent their lives fighting against big tobacco, fighting to reduce the harms of tobacco in our society. And now you see the tobacco control community splitting between tobacco control advocates who see harm reduction as playing a very important role in reducing the harms of tobacco. And on the other hand, tobacco control advocates, all of whom were allied some decades ago in opposing big tobacco, but this other group is now shifting the goalposts, shifting the priorities from being against smoking and against tobacco in the bigger way to being like essentially trying to create a nicotine-free society, what we would call the abstinence-only ideologues when we're dealing with the illicit drug area. Now, I flip back now to my illicit drug background and stuff like this and how we moved. I didn't mean to put it that way, my illicit drug background. My involvement in advocacy around trying to change policies around illicit drugs. We had to be clever about the tactics we pursued. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, the notion that we might begin to embrace harm reduction policies in a majority of the countries around the world, the notion that marijuana might actually become legally available and we would just stop arresting people for it, the notion that we would reverse these trends, all of that just seemed quixotic. It seemed quixotic, as in some respects right now, the battle for tobacco harm reduction globally seems a bit quixotic, right? Here we are in the UK, one of the few governments that, at least relatively speaking, is good on this issue. But where you have, a US government, you have governments from around the world, even governments which see harm reduction, benefiting them. Sweden, where snus has been such a really fantastic contribution in reducing the harms of smoking, will not provide leadership on the harm reduction thing. You look at Japan or Korea or other countries where IQOS and similar devices are resulting in dramatic drops in smoking, right? And once again, these governments will not represent it. It's a little bit, so all you have are the more repressive-minded governments that are really out there pushing constantly and caught up in this thing that we can't support harm reduction because big tobacco is supporting harm reduction. Well, come back to basic principles, right? The core, the essence of harm reduction, right, is in some respect the acceptance in the illicit drug area that there's never been a drug-free society. There's never going to be a drug-free society. Therefore, objectives should not be to get rid of drugs or to try to build a moat between ourselves and these drugs or our children and these drugs, because that can't be done. Rather, the challenge is to learn how to live with drugs so they cause the least possible harm and, in some cases, the greatest possible benefit. That's the essence of harm reduction. Well, now put that over on the tobacco issue, right? Tobacco, we know something about tobacco. It's an incredibly powerful, addictive, compelling substance, right? That not only hooks people in all sorts of ways, but also gives some people pleasures and things that they enjoy and somehow enhances many people's lives, even if you keep smoking it long enough, it's a 50% chance it's going to kill you. Right? We know it took off like wildfire when it came out of the Americas into Europe and around the rest of the world. There was something compelling about this substance, right? We know that, that even as Will pointed out earlier this morning, that even as the percentage of the world population that smokes has declined, we're still stuck at that kind of billion-plus people smoking every year. Not to mention the hundreds of millions of others using tobacco in a very unhealthy oral form in India and other lower-income countries. Therefore, I don't see us moving in the direction of a nicotine-free society. It seems to me the objective has to be to accept that tobacco is here to stay. And that while there were societies in the past that didn't know about tobacco prior to the 1700s, it's highly unlikely that we're going to evolve into a tobacco or nicotine-free world. And that therefore the challenge is to learn how to live with tobacco and especially nicotine so it causes the least possible harms and in some cases the greatest possible benefits, right? That seems like the pragmatic strategy, right? Now, I flash back an illicit drugs thing. I remember 1998, the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. And what was the motto of the UNGAS around drugs in 1998? A drug-free world. We can do it. Which sort of makes you wonder what they were smoking when they came up with that slogan, right? We will cut opium production worldwide by 50%. Well, we're 23 years past that date and it ain't happened. In fact, quite the opposite. It was a ludicrous objective. And we also know that the pursuit of that objective has generated, illicit black markets worth hundreds of billions of dollars each year. It's empowered criminal organizations and corrupted governments and led to massive levels of homicide and violence. It's resulted in drugs being more dangerous than they otherwise would be. It's helped spread HIV and Hep C and all of the negative consequences that flow from a heavily criminalized prohibitionist approach to drugs. We know that that's what's happened as a result. And the drug policy reform movement has been trying to roll that back, to remove marijuana and now psychedelics from the global prohibitionist framework, to push for decriminalization of all drug possession, to push for more regulatory approaches, so that we can begin to move these drugs out of a prohibitionist framework. They call it a global drug control framework. It's not, right? What we know is that prohibition does not represent the ultimate form of control. Prohibition represents the abdication of control. And that's essentially what we've had, is a drug market, illicit drug market that's been out of control. And therefore, to pull these things out and to try to reduce, to decriminalize, to deprohibit the system, not by going towards a free market, but towards a sensible, mindful public health approach that reduces the cumulative harms of drugs, right? Well, the same thing has to be true with nicotine. When we see governments that are banning e-cigarettes around the world, right? When we see all of the other, whether it's the flavored things or maybe all vaping devices, all of these measures, first of all, there is going to be a black market for these things. And we know that people are going to adapt in ways that are going to be harmful to their health and ultimately going to be, non-beneficial, right? So it seems to me that the challenge is how do we somehow maybe, the slogan, the best defense is oftentimes a good offense, right? When people are attacking foundations and others, or researchers and academics, for taking money from big tobacco, when there is almost no government sources and no independent philanthropists in the way that George Soros or some others played that role with illicit drug harm reduction beginning in the 1990s, the other side, the antis, have us in a catch-22. But the question is, when people have proved their bona fides, is it legitimate to discredit them solely because they are taking money from that source? And conversely, when an ideologue is providing overwhelming money to pursue an anti-public health policy, do they need to be called out persistently for doing that, right? So I'm just going to finish up by saying these last couple of things. As Jeannie alluded to before, the big elephant in the room here, I think, really is the future of nicotine. It is the future of nicotine. And the biggest obstacle, I think, that those who favor, and when I say tobacco harm reduction, I'm talking about people who favor tobacco control in which harm reduction plays an important role. The biggest obstacle right now is the huge majority of people who believe that nicotine is far more dangerous than it is. In American polls, you see majorities believe that nicotine is what causes cancer, or why cigarettes cause cancer. A majority of doctors even believe that, believe it or not, as if they never learned the science, right? We have now in America, majority of people believe that e-cigarettes are as or more dangerous than cigarettes, right? We have a majority of people who believe that what happened a couple of years ago with the whole E-Valley thing, with people, people landing up in the hospitals with these lung diseases and 50 or so dying and thousands being hurt, which happened to be about illicitly produced tainted THC cartridges that people were vaping, had nothing to do with e-cigarettes. So there's massive misinformation which is propagated with the support of Michael Bloomberg and his foundation, but also the US CDC, as well as politicians who should know better, some of whom actually do know better and some who don't, right? But that issue is when we look down the road and say, what's the big game here at stake? On some level, what we're talking about is, do we want to persist in a world where probably 1 billion people continue to smoke for decades? The proportion of the population will decline that smokes, but roughly 1 billion people continuing to smoke for decades to come? Or a world in which the number of people who smoke tobacco and consume it in other very dangerous forms drops dramatically, but where the number of people consuming nicotine in safer forms, but that doesn't mean 100% safe, it just means safer forms, is 1 billion, 1.5 billion, or 2 billion. What's the end game of the vape companies and big tobacco? They don't want to eliminate the market for nicotine. They want to shift people now into continuing to consume their products, but at least in a healthier form that continue to serve their bottom line, right? Now, it seems to me that's the big name of the game. So long as people are fundamentally misinformed and miseducated about the realities of nicotine, there's no real way for the harm reduction movement to move all that much further. That has to be corrected, and that's a public education effort. Now, how do you do that? I'll finish off by saying this. One of the things, I'm going to California next week where we'll celebrate the 25th anniversary of the first medical marijuana initiative. right? And that was something that, if you ask the question, how was it that the United States, which for almost a century was the evil empire of the global drug war, nonetheless became the leading pioneering champion of ending the criminalization of cannabis? Well, a good part of the answer has to do with a strategy we figured out 25 years ago, which was by starting off with the incremental step of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, right? And moving forward and using that issue to help transform the broader understanding of what marijuana was and who the marijuana consumer was and what the science was. And, as people began to understand that people could use marijuana for beneficial purposes, it began to be less demonized, a little more accepted, and all this. Financial interest did not play any big role in the marijuana reform movement until just 4 or 5 years ago. Almost all the major breakthrough success was done without their role whatsoever. And so there needs to be innovative strategies, outside-the-box strategies, at helping people rethink nicotine. There needs to be a much greater investment and push one way or another in terms of looking at the positive benefits for nicotine, right? Whether it's Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, the whole host of other diseases. If one has to look at the medicalization of nicotine, and this might be an issue where, tobacco control can unite element, some elements of medicalization that might help provide a movement towards greater acceptability. But one way or another, we have to move away from the notion. We have to challenge the basic abstentionist mindset and prohibitionist mindset of trying to create a nicotine-free world. Because I got to tell you, I'll be damned if after having spent decades of my life rolling back the war on drugs and the criminalization of various illicit drugs in my country, that I'm going to go to my deathbed watching a brand new drug war spreading around the world in which the new target of prohibitionist policies and police agencies, it happens to be nicotine and tobacco products. And my fear is we could indeed land up in that direction. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you.